Please, let's give a round of applause for this 34th annual book fair. This extraordinary event would not be possible without sponsors like the Knight Foundation, OHL Orlano, the Bachelor Foundation, and also the DeGrout Foundation. And as you know, we always celebrate our local heroes who give to the fair. Our friends at the fair who are still here, please give yourselves a round of applause as well. We cannot thank you enough, and we hope we can count on you again for next year. As you know, it's customary for us to ask that you please turn off your cell phone. I just realized you may not know who I am. We've been together all day, but I am Pascal Charlot, Dean of the Honors College, and I work here at Miami-Dade College. And we're just delighted to be able to provide this service to the community. So please, let's give Miami-Dade College a round of applause. This last panel promises to be a very special one as well, and we're very lucky to have John Yearwood, former world editor of the Herald and current chairman of the International Press Institute, all the way from Vienna, Austria. Please join me in welcoming John Yearwood.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Well, welcome to the last event of the Book Fair International, and we have an amazing last event for you. At first, I'd like to introduce Mark Bowden. Mark is the author of 12 books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Black Hawk Down. He reported at the Philadelphia Inquirer for 20 years and now writes for The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, and other magazines. He is the writer-in-residence at the University of Delaware and lives in Pennsylvania. Hugh 1968 is the story of the centerpiece of the Tet Offensive and a turning point in the American war in Vietnam. Please help me welcome Mark. Kurt Anderson is the best-selling author of the novels Heyday, Turn of the Century, and True Believers. He contributes to Vanity Fair and the New York Times, and is host and co-creator of Studio 360, the Peabody Award-winning public radio show and podcast. In Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-year history, a sweeping, eloquent history of America, Anderson shows that what's happening in our country today, this post-factual fake news moment we're all living through, is not something new, but rather the ultimate expression of our national character. Please help me welcome Kurt Anderson. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I feel very honored to be closing out the book festival. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about my book, Hawaii 1968, and then Kurt is going to come up and tell you about his book. And then we're going to have a conversation, and I'd be happy, I think both of us would be happy if you have questions that you line up and fire at us. My book tells the story of what was the worst battle in the Vietnam War. And we were careful to call it the American War in Vietnam because it's told through the eyes of both Americans and Vietnamese. One of the real advantages for me in researching and writing this book is that the country of Vietnam has really opened to Western reporters and journalists. So it was, I think, one of the first opportunities for a writer doing this kind of work to try to tell the story from both sides. And I'm an old journalist, and obviously you learn very quickly there's two sides to every story. And I can't think of a subject about which that would be more true than a battle. So I was thrilled to have the opportunity to do this reporting in Vietnam. I hired a fellow there named Ho Dang Hoa, who is a military officer, a retired military man. And Hoa was great. He understood the bureaucracy in Hanoi. He knew the veterans organization, so he was skilled at finding former North Vietnamese military officers and Viet Cong fighters who I was able to interview. And he also, Hoa is much too young to have fought in the American War, but he is, because of his military background, he was excellent at sort of putting some of these Vietnamese veterans at ease, talking to me. And he also had worked with Ken Burns on the PBS series, so he was just like the perfect find for someone like me. That was the first trip I took to Vietnam was in 2015, and Hoa introduced me to, I probably did 20 to 30 interviews over several weeks, none of which I really understood. Because I don't speak Vietnamese, so I would ask a question and I would get like 20 minutes in response, and then Hoa would give me a 30-second summary. And so when I got home, I hired this young woman named Xuyen Dinh from Ho Chi Minh City, who was a grad student at the University of Delaware, and she very painstakingly transcribed and translated all of these interviews. So sometimes it was months later that I had a chance to read the stories that I'd been told. And so I went back the following year, in some cases to the same people, finally with an opportunity to ask follow-up questions because I hadn't understood them the first time. The problem for me was, though, that in the interim, from 2015 to 2016, someone at the Information Ministry in Hanoi Googled me and decided that I was an important American writer, which apparently doesn't take much. So I got this nice note from the Information Ministry saying that because I was such a significant American journalist and writer, that I was going to have the Deputy Minister of Information for Vietnam would be my personal fixer and guide and translator. And so I sat down to draft a note back saying, thank you very much, no, I prefer working with Mr. Hoa, but was prudent enough to contact Hoa beforehand, and he said, oh no, Mark, this is not an offer you can refuse. So I ended up saddled with Mr. Lean, who was the Deputy Information Minister, and I noticed that this was going to be a different trip right away because when we left Hanoi to drive up to Haiphong to do the first interview, we had to stop and pick up the information chief for Hanoi and the party chief from Hanoi. And then a little further on, we had to pick up the information chief for the province and the party chief from the province. And by the time we arrived at this village, I had a caravan of officialdom behind me, enough to intimidate any Vietnamese veteran from being candid about his experiences. I informed Mr. Lane that I was very grateful at the interest shown in my work, and in fact, afterwards, there was a big lunch for the American writer, and many toasts were raised to the United States and to me, and I said, but I'm going home tomorrow if you don't stop doing this. And so he obliged somewhat. It was easier for me, obviously, to find and interview the American veterans. Nowadays, most of the units who were involved in this battle have websites, and so they have rosters on their websites. And before long, I had a longer list of interviewees than I could ever possibly have done. And I actually find it difficult when I'm working on a project like this to disengage at a certain point. You have to realize when the effort you're putting forth to interview the 125th person is giving you, smaller and smaller returns. So the story of this battle is told from the ground up. I think academic historians tend to work in the opposite direction, from the top down, and they're interested in things like strategy and tactics and historical importance and various political trends and themes, and I'm interested in all those things too, but I'm more of a journalist than I am an historian, and I'm primarily motivated by story. And so I build this account of this month-long battle in Vietnam through the eyes of all of the people I could find who were caught up in the fighting, combatants on both sides and civilians. And in that sense, it becomes a portrait not just of a battle, but of battle itself. This was a particularly terrible example. As I said, it lasted for a month. It left more than 10,000 people killed, 1,800 American casualties, thousands of Vietnamese casualties, both from the South Vietnamese Army and the North Vietnamese, and by far the ones who suffered the most were the civilians in Hue. Hue is probably the most beautiful city in Vietnam. It is composed primarily, the northern part of the city is enclosed in this giant fortress called the Citadel. And this looks like something out of Game of Thrones. It's about 30-foot high stone walls, 30 feet thick, only 9 gates in and out over top of a moat. And so the civilians, particularly in the northern part of the city, inside this 1.5 square mile enclosure, were literally trapped. The communist forces who had taken the city did so with the expectation that the people in the city would rise up in support of the revolution. And that didn't happen. But the civilians who were trying to get out did not endear themselves to the communist troops who had begun setting up their own revolutionary government and rounding up all the people who were affiliated with the Saigon regime. So if you were trying to escape, you clearly were not rising up in support of their effort. And so most people either ran from place to place in the city like ants on a hot plate looking for a safe haven, of which there were few, or they dug bunkers underneath of their houses, and whole families would hide underground, in this case for weeks, where they were safe so long as a bomb or an artillery shell didn't land on their house. And many, many bombs and artillery shells landed on houses, burying and killing people underneath of it. By the end of the battle, 80% of the dwellings in the city were destroyed. 80% of the people of Hue were homeless. The battle itself was probably the most significant shock as part of the Tet Offensive. The United States had been heavily engaged fighting in Vietnam for 3 years, and General William Westmoreland, who was the commander, had been assuring President Johnson and the American people that the war was going really well, that the enemy was on the run, that the best that they could do was to mount somewhat small offensive in the far perimeters, the far reaches of the country. Instead, on the holiday of Tet, every major city and town in South Vietnam was attacked simultaneously. And in the case of Hue, which was the ancient capital of a united Vietnam, the entire city was taken. This came as an enormous shock, I think, as I write in the book. After the Tet Offensive, after the Battle of Hue, the debate in this country was no longer how to win the war in Vietnam. It became how do we get out of Vietnam. So I think this battle was, in many ways, the pivotal one in the war, and I think in some ways it was a watershed event in modern American history, in that the high watermark for our trust and respect in the military and in American leaders was probably the 1950s and 1960s, and I think the Tet Offensive, the Battle of Hue, were the first in a series of blows to our trust in the people who were in charge. Westmoreland, for one, always refused to acknowledge that the city of Hue had been taken, and insisted throughout that there was nothing significant going on in Hue. He estimated pretty much throughout that there were only about 500 enemy troops in the city, and there were, in fact, 20 times that many, 10,000. And as a consequence of that denial, many young Americans were killed. It's one of the really shocking things I discovered in researching this story, is that small units of American Marines and soldiers were repeatedly ordered to attack far superior enemy troops in secure, entrenched positions. And many, many young Americans followed those orders, and many didn't come home. I think, if I write a book that has so many characters, I almost feel the need to apologize for it, because it's just obviously a battle that takes place over a month affects so many people in so many different places and times that it becomes a challenge to tell all those stories. And the way I picture it is, if you've seen these portraits on magazine covers that look like a face, I mean, it's a portrait of someone, but when you get very close, you see that it's made up of thousands of little actual photographs. And each of those little photographs is a pixel. It just adds a color or a tone. So if you step back, it looks like a face, but when you get up close, you see it's actually made up of all these individual tales. And that's how I envision this book. It tries to relate the story of this terrible battle through the experiences of all these people who were caught up in it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Kurt. Thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Mark's book is obviously focuses on this month in 1968. As it happens, we belong together more than maybe the organizers realized. My book, which is truly and literally a 500-year history of America, spends a lot of time in the 1960s, not talking about the Vietnam War passingly, only as one of the things that prompted these profound cultural, mostly fissures in American society. But I look at the 60s from various points of view. What was happening on campuses, what was happening in Christianity, what was happening among in the counterculture, which got its name in 1969. And this book really, I'd written a piece for the New Yorker years ago during the Clinton administration about how the presidency, more and more, really in the television age, since John F. Kennedy, had become a sort of subset of entertainment and what that meant. I'd written a piece for New York Magazine about the movement to get creationism, biblical creationism into the public schools. So, and these were all separate pieces and thoughts that I had done journalism, was doing journalism about, as I was also making my living as a book writer, as a novelist. And then I had this moment in 2004, one of those aha moments where I read this extraordinary quote from then George W. Bush's mastermind, Karl Rove, as the Iraq War was underway and just about to turn bad. And he said famously, people in the reality-based community, he told a reporter, believe that solutions emerge from judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world works anymore. And he was joking, but I realized that, in my mind, dangerously in America, had become not the way the world works anymore. The famous quote that Senator Daniel Moynihan started saying in the 80s and 90s, again, kind of as a joke, everyone is entitled to his or her own opinions, but not his or her own facts, had changed. That was no longer a joke, and it was about to get worse. So anyway, I began thinking about this book. Then I wrote a novel called True Believers, set in the 1960s, at which I began realizing that the 1960s was a crucible for much of what I was thinking about, and that while this DNA of believing the untrue and the unprovable had been a defining part of the American national character for centuries, that it achieved this kind of critical mass in the 1960s that for all of the great things that happened in the 1960s have put us in a pickle 50 years later. Anyway, I'm going to read to you some bits, a bit of the first chapter, which is essentially an introduction to the book, to basically give you my basic theory of the case, and then a little bit from the last chapter, in which I talk about our present day politics. I don't consider all religion or all alternative belief systems or all conspiracy theories or all impossible dreams misguided. Each of us is on a spectrum somewhere between the poles of rational and irrational. We all have hunches we can't prove and superstitions that make no sense. What's problematic is going overboard, letting the subjective entirely overwhelm and override the objective. People thinking and acting as if opinions and feelings were just as true as facts. The American experiment, the original embodiment of the great Enlightenment idea of intellectual freedom, every individual free to believe anything she wishes, has metastasized out of control. From the start, our ultra-individualism was attached to epic dreams, sometimes epic fantasies. Every American one of God's chosen people building a custom-made utopia, each of us free to reinvent himself by imagination and will. In America, those more exciting parts of the Enlightenment idea have swamped the sober, rational, empirical parts. Little by little, for centuries, then more and faster during the last half-century, Americans have given ourselves over to all kinds of magical thinking, anything-goes relativism, and belief in fanciful explanation, small and large fantasies that console or thrill or terrify us. And most of us haven't realized how far-reaching our strange new normal has become. Much more than the other, for instance, much more than the other billion or two people in the rich world, we Americans really believe in the supernatural and miraculous, in Satan on earth right now, reports of recent trips to and from heaven, and a several thousand-year-old story of life's instantaneous creation several thousand years ago. At the turn of the millennium, our financial industry fantasized that risky debt was no longer risky. So many tens of millions of Americans fantasized that they could live like rich people, given our fantasy that real estate would always and only increase in value. We believe the government and its co-conspirators are hiding all sorts of monstrous truths from us concerning assassinations, extraterrestrials, the genesis of AIDS, the 9/11 attacks, the dangers of vaccines, and so much more. We stockpile guns because we fantasize about our pioneer past, or in anticipation of imaginary shootouts with thugs and terrorists. We acquire military costumes and props in order to pretend we're soldiers, or elves, or zombies fighting battles in which nobody dies, and enter fabulously realistic virtual worlds to do the same. And that was all before we became familiar with the terms post-factual and post-truth and alternative facts, before we elected a president with an astonishingly open mind about conspiracy theories, what's true and what's false, the nature of reality. By my reckoning, the more or less solidly reality-based are a minority, maybe a third of us, but almost certainly fewer than half. Only a third of us, for instance, believe with some certainty that CO2 emissions from cars and factories are the main cause of Earth's warming. Only a third are sure the tale of creation in Genesis isn't a literal, absolutely factual account. Why are we like this? That's what this book explores. The short answer is because we're Americans, because being American means we can believe any damn thing we want, that our beliefs are equal or superior to anyone else's, experts be damned. Once people commit to that approach, the world turns inside out and no cause and effect connection is fixed. The credible becomes incredible and the incredible credible. The word mainstream has recently become a pejorative, shorthand for bias, lies, oppression by the elites. Yet that hated establishment, the institutions and forces that once kept us from overdoing the flagrantly untrue or absurd, media, academia, politics, government, corporate America, professional associations, respectable opinion in the aggregate, has enabled and encouraged every species of fantasy over the last few decades. A senior physician at one of America's most prestigious university hospitals promotes miracle cures on his daily TV show. Major cable channels air documentaries treating mermaids, monsters, ghosts, and angels as real. A CNN anchor speculated on the air that the disappearance of a Malaysian airliner was a supernatural event. State legislatures and one of our two big political parties passed resolutions to resist the imaginary impositions of a new world order and Islamic law. A white woman felt black pretended to be, and under those fantasy auspices became an NAACP official. And then Busted said, it's not a costume, not something that I can put on and take off anymore. I wouldn't say I'm African American, but I would say I'm black. Bill Gates' foundation has funded an institute devoted to creationist pseudoscience. The old fringes have folded into the new center. The irrational has become respectable and often unstoppable. As particular fantasies get traction and become contagious, other fantasists are encouraged by a cascade of out-of-control tolerance. In a kind of twisted golden rule, it's a kind of twisted golden rule. If those people believe that, then certainly we can believe this. Our whole social environment and each of its overlapping parts, cultural, religious, political, intellectual, psychological, have become conducive to spectacular fallacy and make-believe. There are many slippery slopes leading in various directions to other exciting nonsense. During the last several decades, those naturally slippery slopes have been turned into a colossal and permanent complex of interconnected, crisscrossing bobsled tracks with no easy exit. Voila, Fantasyland. What I'm calling Fantasyland isn't only a matter of falsehoods fervently believed, but of people assembling make-believe lifestyles as well. Both kinds of fantasy, conspiracy theories and belief in magic on one hand, and fantasy football and virtual reality on the other, make everyday existence more exciting and dramatic. Each of the small fantasies and simulations we insert into our lives may be harmless enough, replacing a small piece of the authentic but mundane here, another over there. The world looks a little more like a movie set and seems a little more exciting and glamorous, like Alfred Hitchcock's definition of drama, life with the dull bits cut out. Each of us can feel like a sexier hero in a cooler story, younger than we actually are if we're old, or older if we're young. Over time, the patches of unreality take up more and more space in our lives. Eventually, the whole lawn becomes astroturf. We stop registering the differences between simulated and authentic, real and unreal. In the old days, if you wanted a shot at becoming instantly rich, you had to travel to Las Vegas. In order to spend time walking around a razzle-dazzling fictional realm, you had to go to Disneyland or Disney World. Theme was not a verb. Pornography was not ubiquitous. Cosmetic surgery was rare. Breasts were not preternaturally large and firm, faces artificially smooth and tight. We didn't reenact military battles with realistic props for days on end. We hadn't yet fabricated the mongrel of melodrama and pseudo-documentary called reality TV. Of course, having fake boobs or playing League of Legends probably doesn't make any individual more inclined to believe that she needs a dozen semi-automatic rifles for self-defense, or that viruses cause autism, or that the Earth is 6,000 years old. But we are freer than ever to custom-make reality, to believe whatever or to pretend to be whomever we wish, which makes all the lines between actual and fictional blur and disappear more easily. Truth in general becomes flexible, a matter of personal preference. There's a functioning synergy among our multiplying fantasies, the large and small ones, the toxic and the individually entertaining ones, the ones we know to be fiction, the ones we kind of, sort of believe, and the religious and political and scientific ones we're convinced aren't fantasies at all. America was created by true believers and passionate dreamers, as well as by hucksters and their suckers, which, over the course of 4 centuries, has made us susceptible to fantasy, as epitomized by everything from Salem hunting witches to Joseph Smith creating Mormonism, from P.T. Barnum to Henry David Thoreau to speaking in tongues, from Hollywood to Scientology to conspiracy theories, from Walt Disney to Billy Graham to Ronald Reagan to Oprah Winfrey to Donald Trump. In other words, mix epic individualism with extreme religion, mix show business with everything else, let all that steep and simmer for a few centuries, run it through the anything-goes 1960s and the internet age. The result is the America we inhabit today, where reality and fantasy are weirdly and dangerously blurred and commingled. Here is close to the end of the book, and after I have taken the reader through 400 years of America, 500 years including the Reformation. During the first 15 years of the 21st century, the GOP turned into the fantasy party with a beleaguered reality-based wing. A far-right counterculture empowered its millions of followers and took over the American right, as their extremist predecessors had succeeded in doing to evangelicalism and the gun lobby 3 decades earlier. This book had been underway for 2 or 3 years when the 2016 presidential campaign began. I had started paying close attention to Donald Trump a long time ago. In Spy magazine, which I co-founded in 1986 and edited until 1993, we devoted many hundreds of hours and many dozens of pages to reporting and researching in 4 cover stories and many other articles about him, exposing and satirizing his lies, brutishness, egomania, and absurdity. Now, everybody knows what we knew back then. In the pre-Twitter age, whenever he sent threatening letters and called us names in public, "It's a piece of garbage," he said of the magazine. It was amazing to us, trippy, as if Donald Duck or Roger Rabbit had turned from the on-screen cartoon universe and replied to us. It was kind of providential that he came along just as we were creating a magazine to chronicle America's rich and famous and powerful jerks. And I guess it's sort of Providence redux that Trump became the center of all attention as I was in the middle of writing a history of America jumping the shark. Donald Trump is a pure Fantasyland being. It's apotheosis. If he hadn't run for president, I might not have mentioned him in this book at all, but here he is, a stupendous Exhibit A. To describe him is practically to summarize this book. He's driven by resentment of the establishment. He doesn't like experts because they interfere with his right as an American to believe or pretend that fictions are facts, to feel the truth. He sees conspiracies everywhere. He exploits the myths of white racial victimhood. His case of what I call kids are us syndrome, spoiled, impulsive, moody, a 71-year-old brat, is acute. And he is first and last a creature of our fantasy industrial complex. He is P.T. Barnum, his sister, a federal judge, said to his biographer in 2005. First, the internet enabled and empowered full fantasy land in the 1990s and aughts. Then it did so for candidate Trump in 2015 and 2016, feeding him pseudo-news on his phone and letting him feed those untruths directly to followers on social media. He is the poster boy for the downside of our digital world. Forget the press, he advised people at rallies. Just read the internet. After he wrongly declared during the campaign that a certain anti-Trump protester, quote, has ties to ISIS, he was asked if he regretted tweeting that falsehood. "What do I know about it?" he replied. "All I know is what's on the internet." But he now thinks the internet is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allows him to find and circulate convenient and exciting untruths easily. On the other hand, Trump read on the internet, Breitbart, InfoWars, that his elite enemies operating the internet, Google, conspired to spread lies to hurt him. Google's search engine, he announced at a rally just before the election, was suppressing the bad news about Hillary Clinton. How about that? Fantastical conspiracy theories, a recurring Trump motif, have also been a recurring motif in this history of Fantasyland. The supposed schemes of witches and Catholics and Masons and Jews, now of Muslims and liberals and internationalists. Trump launched his political career by embracing a brand new conspiracy theory, twisted around 2 other deep American taproots: fear and loathing of foreigners and non-whites. In 2011, Trump became chief spokesperson for the fantasy that President Barack Obama was born in Kenya, a fringe idea that he brought into the mainstream. He wasn't a nut, he was Donald Trump, so that it could be regularly promoted on Fox News and even by an anchor on CNN. Not all lies are fantasies, and not all fantasies are lies. People who believe untrue things can pass lie detector tests. Trump's version of unreality is a patchwork of knowing falsehoods and sincerely believed fantasies, which is more troubling than if he were just a liar. His insistence that he didn't grab or kiss any of the dozen women who in 2016 said he had, unbidden, nothing ever happened, didn't exist, that this was all fantasy land, he said, is a lie, I'm close to certain. But he probably really believed that, quote, the murder rate in our country is the highest it's been in 47 years. The total and dangerous falsehood that he told leaders of the National Sheriff's Association earlier this year in the Oval Office. Whatever he believes or doesn't, he makes untrue assertions more frequently than any U.S. leader in recorded history. He gets away with this, as he wouldn't have in the 1980s and 90s when he first talked about running for president, because now factual truth is just one option, the consensus reality, and Americans do feel entitled to their own facts. When his public approval rating declined during his first month in office, Trump simply refused to believe it. Any negative polls, the president tweeted at dawn one morning from Mar-a-Lago, are fake news. In Fantasyland, refusing to be fact-checked is celebrated. His brazenness is not punished, The Economist magazine noted, but taken as evidence of his willingness to stand up to elite power. Lying works for Trump even when he's denying that he told lies he was recorded telling. From the point of view of political psychology, the University of Connecticut philosophy professor Michael Lynch explains, the more blatant the contradiction, the better. If I simply deny what I earlier affirmed and act as if nothing happened, then you are left having to decide what I really meant. The most disturbing power of contradiction like this is that its repeated use can dull our sensitivity to the value of truth itself. If our sensitivity to the value of truth is dulled, it's easier, obviously, for everyone to become more like him and those in his thrall. Did he really think he lost the popular vote because of a conspiracy that arranged for millions of non-citizens, illegals, to vote for Clinton? I'm a very instinctual person, President Trump said when a Time reporter challenged him on this claim, but my instinct turns out to be right. Did he really think President Obama ordered his telephones to be tapped and that a conspiracy of government officials covered that up? My hunch is that both of those conspiracy theories were closer to sincere beliefs than to simple lies. Excuse me. The people who speak on Trump's behalf to journalists struggle to defend or explain his assertions. They'll sometimes point out that a fantasy was asserted by somebody else. Or they'll ask that Trump be graded on a curve. Because he's new to politics, the things he says mustn't always be taken literally. Asked about the president's statements that are demonstrably not true, the White House counselor asked the reporter to please remember, quote, all the many things that he says that are true. According to the New York Times, the people around Trump say his baseless certainty that he was bugged in some way in Trump Tower is driven by, quote, a sense of persecution bordering on faith. And indeed, the most honest defense of his false statements has been to cast them practically as matters of religious conviction. He deeply believes them, so end of story. That's what the press secretary did concerning the non-existent 3 to 5 million illegal voters. In a single encounter with the press, he earnestly reminded reporters that Trump has believed that for a while and does believe that, and it's been a long-standing belief he's maintained, and it's a belief that he has maintained for a while. Which is why a quarter of Americans subscribe to that preposterous belief themselves. And in Trump's view, that overrides any requirement for facts. Do you think that talking about millions of illegal votes is dangerous to this country without presenting the evidence? The anchor of ABC World News Tonight asked President Trump. No, he replied, not at all, not at all, because many people feel the same way that I do. This is the final paragraph of the book. Cultural predispositions and national characters are real, and societies do come to crossroads and make important choices. But while our Fantasyland tendencies were present from the beginning, the current situation was not inevitable, because history and evolution never are. Nor now is any particular future. We could regain our national balance and composure. These last decades may turn out to have been a phase, one strange act of our ongoing epic, an unfortunate episode in the American experiment that we will finally move past and chalk up to experience. Nations and societies have survived and recovered from far more terrible swerves, eras that felt cataclysmic as they were happening. The good news, in other words, is that America may now be at peak fantasy land. We can hope. Thank you.
Well, in an effort to link my book with yours, Kurt, maybe we can see the Battle of Hue or the Vietnam War as an example of what happens in the real world when a alternative reality leads us into situations where we probably would be best to avoid.
And to know the facts. No, I have, in one of my chapters about the 1960s, I talk about the best and the brightest and the McNamara whiz kids and all these super rationalist brainiacs planning and executing the war in Vietnam, and how that can become its own version of unreality if you only look at body counts and crunch the numbers and pretend to have conclusions that are strictly rational.
Yeah, and and Westmoreland was a disciple of the McNamara school of sort of quantified management, and he did have all these data points like body counts, like defection rates, like tonnage of equipment and ammunition moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, like tonnage of bombs, and he kept track of these data points, and they all told him that we were winning this war handily, and the enemy really wasn't there. So it is another form.
Well, it is, and it also, given that in the 1960s, as there was this kind of religious and quasi-religious and spiritual awakening on so many fronts, it gave rationality a bad name, that it was this debacle in Vietnam that was its, it became its symbol, and therefore, like, no, we don't need rationality in science anymore. That doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, but reality does have a way of asserting itself. And
Yes.
Carl Merlantes, in his review of my book, Carl was a Marine company captain in Vietnam, and he told the story of a friend of his who was a platoon leader who radioed back to headquarters that he was seeing a row of enemy trucks making the way up the hill toward his position. And he was told, that can't be true because they don't have any trucks. And this platoon leader, who was from Texas, said, well, sir, I am where I am, and you are where you are, and where I am, I see goddamn trucks. I think we're gonna,
Sorry, we have time for just one question.
oh, okay, sorry.
It's all on you.
This is a lot of pressure.
Really?
The meaning of life.
That's yours, Kurt.
When I hear you describe General Westmoreland, what comes to my mind is General George McClellan in the United States Civil War, which he trained troops for battles he never actually fought.
Right.
And I was wondering about the parallel with General Westmoreland, just sort of making this all up, putting us into a big hole that we actually never dug out of. And I'm wondering, what was his motivation at all, based on your research, that led him to sort of, lie?
Yeah, well, I think we've all met people, some of us in person and others on television, who have such a firm theory of the battlefield or the marketplace or whatever, that reality doesn't even make a dent. And I think Westmoreland was someone like that. I think he had invested a lot of his ego. He invested a lot of his authority in his theory of what was happening in Vietnam, and he had all the data he needed to back it up. And so, I mean, that rigidity was so evident that when his own field commanders were radioing back that they were encountering vast numbers of enemy forces, he just chose not to believe it. These young officers were accused of timidity or of cowardice. in many cases after having lost half of their men in efforts to do what they were ordered to do. It really is astonishing. So I don't know whether he was deliberately lying, but he was certainly lying to himself.
And what I'll add to that, and that experience, the American experience of being lied to by generals and people all the way up about Vietnam especially, and then of course about Watergate as our war in Vietnam was ending, that fed this ferocious mistrust, default mistrust of government and institutions and the establishment that, in my view, went too far, finally. As correct as that mistrust and skepticism was, it finally went too far and allowed, got us to a place where any set of facts that are inconvenient or unsettling to one can be denied.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we have to cut the questions so short, but thank you for a wonderful discussion. The authors will be in the green signing area to the right of the elevator. Thank you.